Hi, everyone. I think we'll get started. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Sarah Altrell. I'm an associate professor of English here at Northeastern, and I'm also pleased to welcome you as Director of Health, Humanities, and Society. This lecture is generously funded by a grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities, which we were given to expand our curricular work in health humanities and to develop digital dimensions for that work. We're particularly excited by this project, which joins Northeastern's strengths in digital and health humanities, and look forward to continuing to develop a curriculum that prepares students both to address the social and cultural aspects of the data-heavy medicine of the future, and also to be alert to the significant ethical issues that it raises. Today, we're delighted to welcome Lisa Sanders, who's an associate professor of medicine at Yale Medical School. She writes the popular diagnosis column for the New York Times Magazine, and Think Like a Doctor column featured in the New York Times blog, The Well. Her column was the inspiration for the hit program House, and she served as a consultant to the show. In 2010, she published a book called Every Patient Tells a Story: Medical Mysteries and the Art of Diagnosis. She recently collaborated with the New York Times on an 8-hour documentary series that hopefully many of you have seen. It's really quite wonderful, which is about the process of diagnosis for Netflix. Her most recent book, if my information is up to date, is a collection of her columns titled Diagnosis: Solving the Most Baffling Medical Mysteries. Sanders' path to medicine was anything but traditional, and I hope that's actually part of why we wanted to have her here today, and part of what will be so exciting to students who are joining us. As an undergraduate at the College of William and Mary, she majored in English, wrote for the Flat Hat, the college paper, and served pints of ale at Chowning's Tavern in Colonial Williamsburg. After graduation, she took a job with ABC at Good Morning America. Less than 10 years later, while working for CBS News, she won an Emmy for outstanding coverage of a breaking news story for her coverage of Hurricane Hugo as it slammed into her hometown of Charleston, South Carolina. But by then, Sanders said she was ready to move on professionally, and decided that of all the subjects she covered as a journalist, medicine intrigued her the most. After 2 years at Columbia University's post-baccalaureate pre-medical program, she was accepted to Yale School of Medicine as, in her words, quote, part of the 10% of the class they reserve for weirdos. In addition to her time in the hospital, Sanders researches clinical decision-making and the way diagnostic decisions and errors are made, which I hope she'll talk to us more about today. Sanders will be joined by our own Elizabeth Maddock-Dillon, who is Distinguished Professor of English and co-director of the New Lab for Text, Maps, and Networks. Dillon teaches courses in fields of early American literature, the Atlantic theater and performance, and transatlantic print culture. She's the author of New World Drama, The Performative Commons in the Atlantic World, 1649 to 1849 from Duke University Press, which won the Barnard Hewitt Award for Outstanding Research in Theater History from the American Society for Theater Research, and The Gender of Freedom, Fictions of Liberalism and the Literary Public Sphere from Stanford, which won the Heyman Prize for Outstanding Publication in the Humanities at Yale. She's co-editor with Michael Drexler of the Haitian Revolution and the Early US, Histories, Geographies, Textualities from University of Pennsylvania Press. And she's published widely in top journals on topics that range from aesthetics to the novel and performance in the early Atlantic world to Barbary pirates and zombies. She's co-director of the Futures of American Studies Institute at Dartmouth College and former chair of the American Literature section of the Modern Language Association. She currently serves on the editorial boards of CA, Journal of Cultural Analytics, and the Women Writers Project, and has served on the editorial boards of Early American Literature and American Literature, and on the advisory board of PMLA. She's founder of the award-winning crowdsourced digital archive, Our Marathon, the Boston Bombing Digital Archive, and the co-founder and co-director of the Early Caribbean Digital Archive. So as you can see, two very, very accomplished speakers, and I would like you to to join me in welcoming Lisa Sanders and Elizabeth Maddock Dillon. And the last thing that I'll just say is, if you have questions, if you could post them in the Q&A, not the chat, that's where we'll be looking for them. So thank you so much. It's just such a pleasure to have you both today.
Well, thank you, Sari, for a really generous and lovely introduction, and you took all my best stories, so now I'll have to think of new stories. But if I were to put myself back to where you students are right now in your undergraduate times, I must say that I would have never, ever in a million years thought that I would end up being a doctor. It's just not, it was not on my mind. I knew a few pre-meds and thought, I don't think so. So I majored in English, which I think was a much more reasonable, and as it turns out, better preliminary to being a doctor than perhaps pre-med would have been. When I graduated from college, people would say my last year of college, what are you going to do when you graduate? And I said, I'm going to move to New York, because I had been there once and thought, oh my God, this is my place. I belong here. And they go, oh yeah, but what are you going to do in New York? I said, I don't know. I don't care. I just need to be in New York. And so I ended up doing a couple of things that I really loved. First, I worked in theater, and then I worked in television, and they were both about stories. One of the things that I knew for sure from the time I was very young was that stories were where the action was, that everything we knew in life, we knew through stories. And it turns out that everything we know in medicine, we know in stories. So that worked out pretty nicely. My first job in television was at Good Morning America. I covered all of the regulars. So that was a doctor and a lawyer and Julia Child, the cook. So I was their, factotum. I did research and things for them to help them be on television, and then slowly made my way up to being a producer. And the whole time I liked television, but I didn't love television. And so after I'd been doing it for, I don't know, a dozen years or so, I started to look around and think, okay, well, so this was fun. Now what? Now what should I do? And I realized that I thought of all the things that I'd covered, medicine was by far the most interesting. And I thought it had so many of the things that I loved about journalism. It was about stories, although I didn't know that then, but it was changing all the time. There was new things happening. The people who I knew who were pre-med and who were kind of boring had turned into these wonderfully well-rounded, really interesting people who were doing all sorts of interesting things. And so I thought, yes, that could be the place for me. Of course, you can't just, quit your television job and apply to medical school. So I quit my medical school. I quit my television job and went to Columbia and did well enough, and applied to a bunch of medical schools. And I have to say, I got into all of the medical schools, and this is the power of stories. If you can make a good story, you can get into medical school, or at least that's my thought. I thought that if I could explain why my life made sense and why it made sense for me to go to medical school and how I got here, then that would help me get into medical school. And it did. It turns out that doctors understand stories. Doctors like stories. And that's what works very well. And, once I got to medical school, I realized that medicine is a narrative art, and that patients communicate through their stories, and doctors understand the patient through the patient's story. And then they take that story and they transform it into the kind of information they need, plus more, and then they add to it, and then they give it back to the patient. That's really what happens in every medical encounter. And I found myself quite at home here. I found that not only do doctors use the patient's story to identify what's going on, they understand diseases in terms of the story as well. Every disease has a kind of story that happens over time with certain characteristics. And it's by trying to recognize that story in a patient's story that we're able to make a diagnosis. So that's how I got to medicine. When I got to medical school, I spent a lot of time, like we all did, in the first 2 years in classrooms. But then in the third and the fourth year, you got to go out and explore the world of medicine with actual doctors. And when I was doing my internal medicine rotation, I went to a meeting I'd never heard of before called Resident Report. And in that report, I saw the most amazing thing. A person told the story of a patient from when she came to the hospital. And as that story unfolded, the story was related to us as it happened, piece at a time. And at every stop, at every sort of pause in the story, people would ask questions, and what were her symptoms, and what was, so we would see this story unfolding before us and see how people tried to, the doctors in that room tried to put that story together in a way that made sense. And I understood that this was how diagnosis worked. I had no idea. In fact, it was a very well-kept secret at the time. This was a long time ago, but it was a very well-kept secret that there was a lot of uncertainty about diagnosis. I mean, I thought, to be honest, even after covering medicine for like 6 or 7 years, I thought if you have a symptom, you go to the doctor, you tell the doctor what's happening, and he immediately recognizes it. The same way when we see a math problem that requires us to multiply 4 times 6, we know immediately that the answer is 24. There is no other answer that's right. And so I thought when a doctor heard fever and a rash, they're going to think, oh, it's obviously blah-de-de-blah. But, they're actually, what I found out was that, in fact, there were many possibilities. And that is the exciting part of being a doctor, that figuring out how that story works, how that story comes together for this individual lets you make a diagnosis and help the patient. So for me, that was an incredible discovery. So fast forward a few years, and some guy I met in New York called me as part of a project he was working on for the New York Times Magazine. The New York Times Magazine wanted to do something medical. And so he said, what kind of stories can doctors tell? And I said, oh my God, they tell the best story ever. And they tell it every day, all day. And it's this story of making a diagnosis. And took some persuading, but eventually I was able to talk him into it. And that was the creation of my column. And I think the thing that I learned most from that experience was that good ideas are hard to come by. And when you have a good idea, you should pursue it as I did. And I was lucky to have done that. And it's that idea that's really opened up everything that's happened since then. A few years after I started writing my column, in 2002. And in 2004, I got a phone call from a guy named Paul Atanasio. And he said, well, we're working on a television show that we think you might be interested in. I said, okay. I said, tell me about it. He said, well, it's about a doctor who is drug addicted and irritable and arrogant. And he hates patients, but he loves diagnosis. In my head, I thought, who would watch that show? But of course, I didn't say that. I said, oh, do tell. Tell me more. He said, well, can I send you the pilot? And I said, oh, please. And so I saw the first episode of House. When I saw Hugh Laurie in this role, I realized, oh my God, he really gets it. I mean, he's a terrible person. And yet inside that terrible, ornery, crusty, drug-addicted exterior, there is someone who really deeply cares about diagnosis and about people, about that person in any case. And I realized, oh, this is going to be very successful. And fortunately for me and for him and for all of us, it was. And that was just another version of this idea that I had, that I realized that doctors have been hiding from people. I mean, I think that doctors have been, I think they're getting over it, but have been very anxious about the amount of uncertainty there is in medicine. And I think that takes doctors a long time to get used to that uncertainty. And I think that they're afraid that if patients understood how much uncertainty there was, they would feel even less confident about medicine than they do now. But I think they're wrong. I think those doctors are wrong, and that patients appreciate the fact that you spend time thinking about them and trying to figure them out and understand that it is a puzzle. Whenever I send a patient out of my office, I say, this is what I expect to happen. This is what I don't expect to happen. And if what I don't expect to happen happens, you have to call me because I might be wrong. So that's my trip into medicine. I would say the last thing I want to say before I let Elizabeth ask me questions is that a pre-med education is not the best way to become a doctor. Pre-med education is filled with preliminary science, and in preliminary science, there is a correct answer for every question. And if you want to know what that answer is, you just go to the back of the book and look. It's always there. That's not how medicine is. Medicine has a lot of uncertainty, and it's very hard for people with traditional pre-med educations, I think, to deal with that uncertainty. And yet people with a liberal arts background, they know that uncertainty. We have lived in that uncertainty. We have swum in that uncertainty. We don't call it uncertainty in literature. We call it suspense, right? We don't know what's going to happen. And in fact, that's why we keep reading, is to find out what happens. And we live with that uncertainty. It's not terrible and scary. Well, sometimes it's terrible and scary, but it's always thrilling and exciting as well. And it's that sort of comfort with not knowing what the answer is, knowing that you can't just flip to the back of the book and find out the answer, that I think makes the liberal arts the best possible training to become a doctor. So now, that's my spiel and my pitch for you to go to if you go to medical school, to go to pre-med, to do a post-bac pre-med, but get your English in first.
Thank you, Lisa. We're just gonna broadcast that on our English department website on repeat for a very long time. I particularly like what you were saying about uncertainty and thinking about thinking about how to think through uncertainty and how to live with uncertainty. I often tell my students when they read something that's really hard, I say, you know, this is going to be really hard and you're not going to understand it. But that's good, because what you need to figure out is what you do understand and what you don't understand. And then the more you think about it, then that will change, right? But the point is, you have to be able to enter into a world where you don't know everything and you can't figure things out in order to learn anything. And so if all you're after is just the constant mastery, it doesn't take you anywhere new. Uh, so so I just want to I'm just going to share that with the folks here, that Lisa and I are old friends because we essentially raised our daughters together, and they're now like grown-up people, somewhat grown-up people. And the other thing that we did was that we used to go running a lot together, and we would talk and talk and talk about all kinds of things. And so I've had a lot of time to talk to Lisa about her work, and I just want to share a few of the things, or invite you to speak about a few of the things that have really stuck with me over the years that you've told me about your work. And one of them is the your sense of connection to Sherlock Holmes. So I just wondered if you could say a little bit about that, because it really vividly brings to the fore this kind of relationship between narrative and medicine, and thinking about the you know, the way in which we engage in literary texts and the process of diagnosis, that as you think about it.
Well, thank you. I'm a huge Sherlock Holmes fan. I'm a kind of a Sherlock Holmes nerd. I belong to several clubs that have to do with Sherlock Holmes. I present papers on Sherlock Holmes every year. So, I mean, I'm a serious nerd, but I read him first. I read Arthur Conan Doyle first when I was in high school. And I thought they were great stories, and I loved the character, and I loved Sherlock Holmes. I didn't think much about Watson, as you don't. But then when I got to medicine, I recognized how much of a doctor's creation Sherlock Holmes was. You know, I think that, you know, Arthur Conan Doyle was a physician, and he actually based the character of Sherlock Holmes, at least in part, on one of his professors who he cherished very much, Joseph Bell. And, you know, he writes about Joseph Bell's amazing ability to take a piece of information and understand its real meaning. So, for example, he talks about how when he was working in Bell's office, a woman came in with her child, and Bell immediately asked her how her ferry ride from wherever she came from was. And she said, "Oh, it's fine, but how did you know that I came from this place?" And he said, and I see that you've dropped your other child off with a friend over on so-and-so street, and said all these amazing things that were quite true. And she was baffled, as was Arthur Conan Doyle. And he said, "Well, it's obvious that you came from this place because of your accent. And it's obvious that you've been over on this part of town because I see that kind of mud on your shoe. And I know that that's only seen here. And you have your other child's coat over your arm." And so just seeing what was in front of him and interpreting it, not just taking it and going, "Oh," but really trying to understand what it meant, is this fundamental quality of diagnosis. And so I've always loved that about Sherlock Holmes. You know, he asks Watson, who is a doctor, who doesn't have any of these skills, he says, Watson is always asking him how he does these things, how Sherlock Holmes ever does these things. And he said, "Well, I try to always notice what I see." And Watson goes, "What do you mean by that? You know, of course we all notice what we see. We're seeing it. We're noticing it." And he says, No. How many stairs are there up from the first floor to here, to the second floor apartment where we live?" And Watson goes, I don't know. This is what I do. They're 17, of course. I knew that from the first because I notice what I see. And I would say that that is really the heart of medicine, not counting the number of steps to the second floor, but really paying attention to what you see and trying to make it make sense, to really noticing what you see. And so that's been my passion for Sherlock Holmes. You know, some people, I write the diagnosis column, a column called Diagnosis for the New York Times Magazine. And in this column, I tell the story of a patient who presents for medical attention with unusual symptoms. And doctors have a hard time figuring it out and I trace them until they get the diagnosis. And people have said to me, well, you're the Sherlock Holmes of medicine. And I'm like, actually, no, I'm Watson. I write about the many, many Sherlock Holmes in medicine. Sometimes it's me, but most times it's somebody else. No, not Sherlock Holmes, Watson.
Thank you. That's so great. I mean, I really love that. It's a very vivid account of what diagnosis is. And it brings me to something else that I've heard you say that has also stuck with me a long time, which has to do with some of the pitfalls of contemporary medical practice / training that I know you also think a lot about. And one of the things that I've heard you say, well, in effect, it's part of the premise of your book, Every Patient Tells a Story, is that there's not enough attention paid to paying attention, right? So that contemporary medical practice often encourages doctors to run a whole slew of tests and then to look at the test results as opposed to speak to the patient, right? So I wonder if you could say a little bit about that tension between noticing, speaking to the patient versus the diagnostic testing regime and that those possibilities that are obviously very valuable, but the ways that they can perhaps sometimes get in the way of actually hearing a different story that's valuable too.
Oh, there's so much to talk about there, and I'll try to be brief. But, you know, there was for a moment, I don't do that now, but there was for, 5 or 10 years, there was this idea that when people came into the emergency room, the triage nurse could just decide what tests to order on a patient. And so every patient would have this massive order of tests. The problem is that, of course, tests are not 100%. Tests can be wrong. And so it can send you in the wrong direction. I call it shooting a patient in the face with the diagnostic shotgun. You know, you pepper them with questions, but you're not sure what's going to hit them and what's going to be wrong. So I'm against that, obviously. I think that the patient will tell you what's going on. What I explain to my patients and to residents is that a doctor-patient encounter is really an encounter between two experts. There is the patient and the doctor is the expert on bodies and anatomy and physiology and diseases, but the patient is the expert in their body, their anatomy, their disease, their symptoms, and no one can tell you what that patient feels except that patient. You don't know. There's no test that will let you know that this patient is feeling this. So the only way to find out is to absolutely ask them and then listen to them. You know, the other thing about doctors is they feel there's a kind of anxiety that goes with listening to a patient, especially a sick patient, telling you their story. You don't want to make a mistake. You want to make sure you get everything. And the temptation is to interrupt that patient and start asking yes or no questions. And of course, the patient doesn't know how to be a patient. Nobody's taught them how to be a patient. You, As the doctor, you're teaching them how to be a patient. And if you teach them that what you want is yes or no questions, then the only answers you're going to get are yes or no. And so you don't even know what you don't know from this patient. You only hope that before you interrupted them and started them to talking, started them answering yes or no, that you got out enough. So, I mean, I think that being a doctor means listening and thinking and observing and trying to make it all make sense. But it starts with, of course, the patient and not the patient's labs. Even now, when you go in to see a patient in the emergency room, before you even get to the patient, you will see their past medical records, their labs, what other people say about them, before you have a chance to see for yourself. It's the way it is now. I try to teach people to do otherwise. I'm not sure I'm winning.
So I'm going to ask just one more question that I can't quite restrain myself from asking, and then we have some. I know that Sari has some thoughts, and we have questions from our audience as well. So my question is about the last thing I wanted to touch on was the TV show Diagnosis from Netflix, which for those of you who haven't seen it, I can't recommend it enough. It was really eye-opening for me. And the thing that was most eye-opening for me was the fact that as you kind of got into the lives of the patients whose illnesses you were seeking to diagnose, how much of their medical condition ended up being about things like their relations with their family, their problems with insurance, their working situation. So in other words, it was exactly the kind of things that a set of tests was never going to reveal. It was actually the larger context and the kind of relations in which they lived in the world that had to do with informing their health. And so for me, that was very profound, partly because, again, as somebody who's interested in the humanities and the interdisciplinary humanities, I think the humanities invites us to think about context a lot, and framing and reframing. And that was really powerfully conveyed to me from that TV show. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that question of sort of looking outside of the encounter in the doctor's office to those larger stories and contexts.
Thank you for asking that, because that's such an important part of medicine. I mean, we think of a patient as being somebody who is sick, who is having symptoms, but it's not just them and their symptoms that is there before you. It's their whole life, and eliciting the real context of their symptoms is a key part of not just making a diagnosis, but finding a treatment that's going to work. And just, I don't know if I don't know how many of you have seen this series of diagnoses, this series of documentaries, but the first one has to do with a young woman who has the terrible muscle pains that come normally after she's exercises. And she has lived with this terrible, terrible pain for almost 10 years without getting a diagnosis. And I came to realize when we spent time with her that the reason that it took so long, the diagnosis was not hard. Let me just be clear. The diagnosis was not hard. But the reason that she didn't get the diagnosis was because for much of that time, she had never had insurance. Or for much of that time, she hadn't had insurance. And so she sought her care in emergency rooms. And emergency rooms could take care of the presenting problem, but the underlying problem, the real problem, which was a genetic problem, they couldn't deal with because, not their job. And, they weren't even thinking about it. Their job in hospitals is to keep you from dying. not necessarily to keep you from coming back again. So it wasn't until she was able to get a more comprehensive approach to her medical problem that it was clear what was going on and how it was going to get fixed. In another episode, a young woman had this problem where it was hard for her to keep food down. It came up not as vomiting, but just as a regurgitation. It was very weird. And she ended up having to have intravenous fluids. She had a line, an intravenous access point put into her chest so that she could get intravenous fluids. A completely insane intervention, but one that was necessary for her because she couldn't keep anything down. And I spent time with her and her mom and her family. And I came to understand that the family dynamics made it important to her and to her mom that she be sick. It was important in their family that she should be the sick one. And it also worked for her. I mean, she told me, she goes, "Oh yeah, before I got sick, I was chubby. They used to always talk about what a big bottom I had. And now, now I'm as thin as my sister. And nobody makes fun of the way I look anymore." And I realized, okay, there is something in it for you. So that explained, I mean, her diagnosis also, once it was made, was very clear. She refused to accept it because to accept it would mean that she would have to give up her day job as being the sick one in the family. So all these, who people are and what their lives are, play such an important role in what they want from you as a doctor, what their story means to them and to you. So it's not just somebody's sore foot that brings them in to see you. It's really what that sore foot means to them. And if you don't understand what it means to them, then there's a very good chance that you're not going to be able to really help them. So that kind of story, we teach this to all of our residents and to all of our medical students, that understanding the backstory, what brings you in today, it's not just the sore foot, but the whole thing, what really brings you in today is the answer that you need to have in order to come up with the full patient story and diagnosis.
It seems not very easy to do. I want to pass it to Sarah here to share some thoughts and questions.
Yeah, thank you so much. That was so great. And I think I can already tell in part from the questions that I think the students are getting just so much out of this. So thank you for sharing your path. And I have a ton of questions myself. and I was writing down some of the ways that you phrase things that I think are just so useful. I'll begin by asking two questions that I had. And one has to do, I guess, in part with this question, with this framing that you just were talking about the relationship between the sort of like the crisis of that's really I studied 19th century medicine. So I think that that's really a 19th century medical word, but the really like the acute presenting symptoms that the patient comes in with. And you talked about the sort of boundedness of the narrative within the sort of like arriving at the hospital to the point where the patient leaves the hospital. And I guess part of what I was interested in was how you decide what goes in the story, what doesn't go in the story, how is the story bounded? And partly I ask because both in the column and also in the series, that's, that work has kind of already been done, right? There's in the editing process, there are a lot of decisions that are made about which of the details are relevant, which of the details are not relevant. So I'm just, so my first question is about how you bound the story, how you decide what actually belongs in the narrative and what doesn't belong in the narrative. And then the second question I had was about a word that I thought it was kind of, I kept expecting you to use and then, and you didn't. And so I thought I would ask about it, and that's creativity. So I think, you know, a lot of what you've described about diagnosis has to do with this kind of investigative work. But the old definitions of imagination and creativity have to do, you know, not with wholesale invention, but instead with this idea that you look at something or you look at a set of facts and you see something different than what other people see. And it's in and of itself a creative act. And so, I guess I know creativity is both something that certain people in the health humanities and in the medical field are kind of interested in now. I also know that probably, you know, patients would be made a little uncomfortable if they thought of their physicians as inventive. So yeah, I guess those are sort of my two questions. How do you bound the story? How do you figure out what belongs in the narrative and what doesn't? And then on the other hand, how do you think about creativity? I mean, I guess I'm asking in part because part of it is about uncovering, but part of it also seems to be about something a little bit more generative than that.
Well, it's interesting that you should focus on creativity because, of course, we don't think of ourselves as being creative. I think of myself as being creative, but I mean, I think in general, doctors think that we're figuring things out, and they don't recognize that that is intrinsically a creative act, because figuring things out means, first thing that you talked about, figuring out what belongs in the story and what belongs outside the story, and putting them together in a variety of ways. And then I would say, because of the anxiety of not knowing when somebody's life could be at stake, you know, the desire to come up with a quick answer, to go with the first answer that comes to mind that fits close enough, is almost overwhelming. And we have to train ourselves to hold back and ask a question that I think is ultimately quite an expression of the creativity of medicine, which is, what else could this be? You know, you want to call it this because it looks like this, and it's the first thing that comes to mind, but you can't. You have to keep an open mind. You have to think, what else could it be? So that's essential. You can't be a doctor if you're not willing to invite uncertainty into your life, into your thinking. So I think to me, that's the ultimate creative act as a doctor, is inviting the multiple possibilities and then trying to sort through them. But the first part of your question of deciding what's in the story and what's outside the story, you know, is a really interesting question. You know, we have something in medicine called Occam's razor. You know, William of Occam, I don't know, 13th century philosopher or mathematician. I think he was a philosopher. And basically, the way we understand one of his basic principles is that the simplest answer is going to be the right answer. So you think all these symptoms must have to do with this disease, and you have to figure out something that accounts for all of these things. And of course, there's tremendous intellectual satisfaction if you can make everything fit into this tidy little diagnosis. We have another principle in medicine, not nearly as old, from a guy named John Hickam. We call it Hickham's dictum. He was a doctor in the 50s who died, I don't know, in the 70s perhaps. And he says, a patient can have as many damn diseases as they want, which means you can aspire to the elegance of a single solution for a problem. But there's always the possibility that there's more than one problem there, because there's no limit to how many diseases that people can have. And so that process of trying to figure out what's in and what's out is one of the key things that we wrestle with all the time. And you don't really know until time has passed and you see what happens whether you're right. And you often have to go back and revise. Well, maybe this congestive heart failure is not part of this illness. He has that on his own. You have to figure out what's in and what's out. It's an important part of the process. And one we don't get to talk about nearly often enough.
Thank you. I'm going to go ahead and read from some of the questions in the Q&A. And if anybody wants to add to that, feel free to go ahead and type your questions in there. The first two questions are both from Jillian Osborne, so I might kind of bundle them together for you. They ask if you have other thoughts about possible connections between medicine and other forms of literature and art, like poetry or visual art, rather than just narrative. So what role does observation or other faculties of form making without narrative play in diagnosis? And then the second question is about sympathy versus empathy, particularly in relationship to Hugh Laurie and his lack of empathy. So the question is, do you really need empathy to be a good diagnostician, or is that not so significant? So non-narrative art forms and sympathy and empathy.
With Gregory House for a minute. So he didn't have any empathy. It's absolutely true. And he might have had sympathy, but he's a fictional character and he probably wouldn't be a very good doctor. I don't know that you have to have empathy to be a good doctor. I do know that you have to have empathy to be a good person. I think it's important to be able to make a connection with your patient. A patient entrusts their life to you, and they're going to only be honest and take your advice if they trust you. And I would say empathy is the ability to understand the person enough to figure out how to make a connection. I think that's the most important part of medicine, is to be able to make that connection, to understand what they want from you. That's empathy. And then try to provide that for them and to understand sort of where they're coming from. That's where the trusting relationship comes from. And without that, without that, everything falls apart. If they don't trust you, they're not going to tell you the whole story. They might tell you the whole story of their symptoms, but they're not going to tell you the whole context, which I've already said is a huge part of the real story. And even if you're able to make a diagnosis with what little they give you, you're going to come up with treatments, but they're not going to take them. Most people do not do what their doctor tells them to. And I'm not talking about just, you should really exercise more or eat fewer fats. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about things that people say that they can do, like taking their medicine. Most patients do not take their medicine the way their doctor tells them to. And it's been shown that having a good connection with your patient is the difference between them not taking their medicine the way they're supposed to and doing what you tell them to do. So those qualities of humanity are essential in being a doctor. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to do anything for your patients. And I forgot what the first question was.
The first question was about narrative art, like thinking about visual art or poetry or other ways that's significant.
So one of the best classes that I ever took was from a dermatologist who noticed that, dermatology, totally a visual field. You see something, you know it or you don't know it. Or that's how it's always talked about. But this guy, Erwin Braverman, noticed that his residents, his trainees, were seeing something and going directly to the conclusion without actually noticing what they saw. And so if that conclusion, that diagnosis turned out to be wrong, they didn't have anything to come back to because they weren't noticing, they weren't observing. And so he taught this class at the British Art Gallery where they would go around and look at pictures and they were not able to say anything except what they actually observed. And then when they've observed everything that was to be seen in the picture, then they could talk about what it meant. It was just trying to instill in them this habit of seeing. Another class I took was given by a painter, and she showed this picture and she asked everyone to respond to it. And then she showed what the title was. And so you knew what it was about. But before that, you were open to the possibilities. So I think that there's a lot of different kinds of art, certainly it's poetry, visual arts, it's all about looking and seeing what you see instead of looking at the name of the picture and seeing what you think you're supposed to see. Actually being open to what's in front of you, I think is essential in medicine. And I think we learn that from the visual arts. And poetry, to me, the poetry that I like is about encapsulating a moment, not something that happens over time, but something that exists in front of you immediately. And I think that the kind of gestalt you get from seeing patients when seeing an individual is kind of similar to me to poetry, which tries to describe a moment, a flash, a feeling. So I see that as being similar. That's how it seems to me in any case. As for music, music is all about the narrative to me. It's not a story, with heroes and villains, but it's the music itself is a narrative, and you can follow sort of the different threads of the narrative. And I think it's in the same way, filled with suspense. You're waiting for this resolution to bring all of these things together that you've heard, bring them together. I think the arts are very much what medicine is about.
I really love that emphasis on seeing without jumping to conclusions, right? And how much you can see before you decide what it means, and how much that opens up. And I think that connects to that, to the issues of uncertainty, the issues of interpretation, the issue of creativity, right? Because it is a creative act to be open long enough to have new possibilities arrive, as opposed to say, I know this, this is what I already know. All right, so we have a couple more great questions here. So this is from Ashley Brown, who says, you have such an interesting path related to medicine. Understanding the uncertainty around medicine particularly resonated with me. I think the same principle can apply to scientific research. Are there particular measures that you advocate for to prepare physicians for uncertainty that you think can help prepare lab scientists too?
Read more novels. I think that, the best science is filled with uncertainty. That's not the way medical students are taught science. They're taught, the rudiments of science where all the answers are known. But, the real fringes of medicine, of science, where there is uncertainty, that to me, I don't know how scientists do it, but I would think that being willing to be open to a lot of different possibilities and not ruling something out because it's so unlikely would be helpful. I don't know. That sounds like an exciting life you're in pursuit of. Tell me more.
So I think we have time for one last question, which we have here in the Q&A from Jaeyoon Lee. Hi, Jay. Nice to see you here virtually. And Jay says, I really thought it was insightful in regard to listening and recognizing the stories patients have to see in who they are. Are there instances in which it's important to recognize the stories that you, as the patient care provider, carry and have? Or what ways does the provider story matter in the patient-provider relationship? Good question.
Wow, that's a really hard question because, because I, to my patients, when they, want to talk to me about my life, this is not about me. This is about you. But I know that my own experiences and prejudices and preferences shape who I am as a doctor and who I am, who I am as a person, certainly. But I know that it shapes who I can take care of best. For example, I come from a family that's where, like many families, addiction has been a terrible problem. And so there's lots of ways you can go with that. It could make you more open to the kinds of issues that are surrounding addiction. But for me, it's given me a fear of people who have problems with addiction, or a kind of unreasonable worry about something bad happening to them. It's made me crazy, but it's just something that I've recognized about myself. I hope that, my patients haven't felt but, you have to, it's just, it's, maybe it was Buckaroo Banzai, a movie from the 80s, who said, no matter where you go, there you are. You drag this self around with you, no matter, still you that's doing all this stuff, and you just have to manage it as best you can. I think in some ways, I'm a very good doctor in other ways because of my experiences. But you happen to, you asked me the question, and the first thing, I have such anxiety about what could happen to them. It's not good for them. It's clearly the best relationship you can have with a patient. Concerned about them, distance, so that you're not worried about them. Concern and care are different than worry. Worry is destructive. So, yes, no matter where you go, there you are, and
all right,
can't get around it.
We're at time here, so I just want to say how incredibly exciting this is. In the English department, we have our biggest combined major now is biology and English. So there really are a lot of students, I think, who are extremely interested in the kind of approach that you're talking about. And so to have you articulate that value and your experiences there is just is incredibly helpful for our students and for opening our minds to think about these things. Sarah, would you like to?
Yeah, I also just wanted to thank you. We have a number of students who joined us on this Zoom webinar who are really interested in health humanities, but also interested in being pre-med. And I think a lot of the work that we've been doing together, frankly, has been figuring out how to articulate how those interests match up. And so actually, one of the students on the call is creating her own independent major to try to figure it out. So I think, there is a lot of grappling with these kinds of questions. And I think it's just so helpful to hear from someone who has spent a career answering them, exactly what they look like. And it was just really, really fantastic. So thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me, and great to see you, Elizabeth. Nice to meet you. Sorry. And to all the students out there, thanks.